Hello everyone, I'm Rohit Gandhi and you're watching Democracy and Dictatorship. One of the elements key to sustaining a democratic or a dictatorial setup is physical structures that convey the ideology of that state. Throughout history, leaders have established their power through the creation of tangible symbols. Antiquities changed hands as regimes rose and fell. The British Empire, the Nazis, the Taliban, they all understood the symbolism of possessing pieces of another culture's history. Our correspondent, Giles Gibson, has been looking into the relationship between antiquities and power.
Want to get into the war?
Monuments Men.
I'm to put a team together and do our best to...
In The Monuments Men, Matt Damon and George Clooney crisscross Europe in a mad dash to save precious antiquities from the retreating Nazis. But this is no Hollywood fantasy. Antiquities have been used as a weapon of war for centuries.
We got company. Frank, we gotta go!
That's what Hitler wants.
And they're playing a central role even in today's bloodiest conflicts across the world. The Islamic State has looted ancient sites in Iraq and Syria for profit, as well as tearing them apart in disdain. Archaeologist Khaled al-Assad spent much of his life working at the ancient city of Palmyra. He understood the need to protect cultural heritage so deeply that he paid for it with his life. ISIS militants beheaded him after capturing the site in 2015. Russia too used the ancient city to show off their new role in the Syrian conflict. Classical music played by a Russian orchestra filled the city's amphitheatre after it was recaptured. And antiquities aren't just playing a role in conflict. In India, the Koh-i-Noor diamond has become a symbol of the wounds of empire. The 105-carat gem is a centerpiece of the British royal family's crown jewels, after coming into their possession in the 1800s. In 2010, the then British Prime Minister David Cameron said the diamond will stay put, but the Indian Culture Ministry says it should be returned. Antiquities are pieces of history, physical representations of our own connection to the past. And as history shows, the very hands that they fall into can be just as important and symbolic as their own backstory. This is Giles Gibson reporting for WION in New Delhi.
Iraq was the cradle of civilization, and the ruins of Nimrod are testimony to that civilization. But no more today. Nimrod stands desolate after the Islamic State vented its medieval fury on it. Our correspondent Daniele Pagani, who has been reporting from the front line in Iraq, brings you the story from the ruins of Nimrod.
On November 15th, the Iraqi army secured an area approximately 30 kilometers south to Mosul, where the Islamic State blew up an important Assyrian archaeological site. What they found confirmed the worst fears. The site is completely destroyed.
This city, the city of Nimrud, was the capital city of the Assyrian civilization, and this door, where I am, was one of the main entrances for the city. 2 years ago, before the Islamic State conquered this area, here on the two sides of the door, there were two sculptures called lamassus, those mythological creatures with a human head and the body of a bull or a lion and with wings. They were meant to protect this ancient city. The Islamic State militants destroyed these forms of art because they did not consider it belonging to the Islamic tradition, and they consider to be pre-Islamic art, which according to them is not to be respected and must be destroyed.
As we walk inside the city, the level of destruction appears clear. There is almost nothing left. Islamic State terrorists surrounded Nimrud with barrels full of explosive and triggered them all together. One of the many signs of destructions that the Islamic State terrorists carried on in these very ancient archaeological sites. As we can see, we have inscriptions here in these slabs of stone. Must be 3,000, more than 3,000 old, because the site has been here for the last 3,500 years. And it just took 2 years of Islamic State presence to destroy that. Speaking with people in the small neighboring town, they told us that a few days before the Islamic State destroyed the archaeological site, several buyers from Turkey and Syria showed up to purchase the precious and many beautifully carved antiquities coming from Nimrod. A proper assessment of the extent of damage and what can be salvaged will probably take place only after fighting ends. What we witness here in the ancient archaeological site of Nimrud in Iraq raises questions about what is happening to all the heritage which is still under Islamic State control, for example, within the city walls of Mosul. The strategy of the Islamic State is not to recognize as plausible any form of art which is considered by them coming from pre-Islamic societies. The only way to deal with this kind of art for them is to completely destroy, to erase it. Daniele Pagani and Martin Aim from Nimrud, Iraq, for WION.
We've all seen images from Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria, where fundamentalist groups have ransacked and looted historical sites. At one level, this is ideological. It is about destroying ancient heritage. But security experts also believe that often terrorist groups tend to loot artifacts from these sites and sell them into the black market to fund their activities. Here is WION's correspondent Manoj Keval-Ramani with that report.
In December last year, the United Nations Security Council made a startling revelation. Resolution 2253 identified trafficking of antiquities as the second most important source of funding for the Islamic State. ISIS had in the past been condemned for destroying ancient artifacts in Syria and Iraq and using looted antiquities for funding. But this resolution was the first real recognition of the serious implications of the trade in looted artifacts.
We've seen evidence of ISIS paying people to dig in known sites and moving these objects along to the marketplace, holding auctions of their own if items didn't sell where they thought they might sell.
Given the sophisticated nature of this trade, with the involvement of people across multiple nations and forged documents being commonplace, there is little clarity on how much money is funneled to terrorist groups through these so-called blood artifacts. Experts, however, believe that whatever the amount, the trade poses a substantial security risk.
I think according to the State Department figures, it's something on the order of tens, maybe millions of dollars worth of sales. It's not a huge amount, but then I like to tell people that you don't need that much money to do very nefarious things these days. It's not that expensive to put a bomb together, frankly, or even buy a gun or a machine gun. So this is all fairly cheap stuff. So they're not. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a huge market, but it's enough to do damage.
Clamping down on this trade, however, is not an easy task. The primary concern here is about the lack of information regarding these artifacts. When in countries like India, millions of artifacts remain off the government radar, one can only imagine how difficult it is to maintain records in war-torn countries like Syria and Iraq. This is a concern that Christopher Marinello's Art Recovery International is looking to address with a new initiative.
We created an incredible database with image recognition software that allows the trade to check the database to see if anything they're offering for sale is looted or stolen, and victims worldwide, governments, museums, can record objects on this database so that in itself it creates matches that will help us recover them.
Art Recovery International is also looking to work with organizations like the India Pride Project to document artifacts. India Pride Project is an initiative by a group of private citizens who are working to bring lost and stolen Indian antiquities back to the country.
So our first effort is to make sure that we get back what's stolen. The other part, which is increasingly becoming more important for us, is creating awareness and making people understand how big the problem is.
There have so far been no documented cases of stolen Indian antiques being used to fund terror groups. But there are believed to be linkages between the networks that ship them outside and those that smuggle Syrian or Iraqi antiques. So what should governments be doing to crack down on this trade? Some experts are calling for the creation of heritage police units to track stolen antiquities. Others want greater partnerships with private players, given the funding limitations that governments face. Either way, the starting point has to be a recognition of the fact that the loot of ancient heritage is not just a cultural issue, it is also an economic and security concern. With Mandy Clark in London, in New Delhi, this is Manoj Kevalramani, WION.
The stories so far clearly show the extent of the damage and the display of strength through the destruction of the old and symbolic, whether religious, national or cultural. Let's take a quick break now. More on the other side when we return. Welcome back to Democracy and Dictatorship. We have with us in studio Ashish Nandi, a renowned sociologist and clinical psychologist. He's also an honorary fellow with the Center for the Study of Developing Studies. Thank you for joining us for the show today, Dr. Nandi. Let's start by talking about the physical, cultural aspects of societies. How important are they to kind of talk about what society it was and historically where it's placed?
The cultural part is very important. No society is without a culture, and the culture distinguishes it. Not its structural components, not its geopolitics, but it is the culture which makes a country or a society.
Sure.
And I do believe that unless you have a clue to that, you do not know what are the unique potentialities and unique handicaps of a particular society.
So when we look at physical symbols, for example, let's look at the Bamiyan Buddha. That in itself talks about its point of time in history, it talks about what it was. Explain to me, what does that symbolize when you blow up things like the Bamiyan Buddha?
That I love to believe was an act of rage, but I still think it an abominable, horrendous act which is an attempt to insult 1 billion adherents of Buddhism and anybody who is interested in civilizations and cultures, because the Bamiyan Buddhas are markers of civilization. By destroying it, the Taliban actually diminished Afghanistan's own self-definition. It has become narrower, symbolically at least, and no future generations will not forgive them for that, nor would their own grandchildren and grandchildren's grandchildren.
Are there international laws around this when you actually destroy these symbols of cultural existence?
Most of our international laws were formulated after World War II. And let us not hide that fact anymore. Then allies were also involved on a lot of vandalism. Not only Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was particularly not a military target. There was no reason why they should have chosen it. The situation after World War II was not congenial to formulating new laws and international covenants which would handicap the Western powers. Many of them had colonies,
right,
and their behavior towards cultures and cultural symbols not often were very good.
So you think we still haven't learned from it, and we haven't formed those
we don't have
international
exactly
laws?
the appropriate laws.
Dr. Nandi, what are the obligations of the military to protect such symbols? Is there laws around that?
Not really. But that is, I would say, least of the problem, because even if there were laws, military conflict or clash is such a thing where these laws are normally flouted unless you have very strong legal prescriptions and you are afraid of being tried later on. I am sure if terrorists take refuge in a temple in India, the temple will be demolished. And it happened in case of the Golden Temple. Right. Military is not the real problem. I mean, you can say that avoid military conflict near cultural artifacts, but that's a different thing. I think the greatest danger to cultural symbols is from one's own leadership and politicians. And so, like, for example, development. Now, development doesn't have the kind of urgent necessaries which the army sometimes feel it faces. But development always has been very destructive of major cultural symbols and major cultural artifacts.
When you look at, for example, let's look at the Rwandan situation. When they went on after the war finished, they kind of erased some of the evidences of cultural symbolism from that country. So how does a society move on sometimes? What does it take for them to move on? And sometimes
they move on a new basis, and I'm afraid that is no way of negotiating that past, because that past lives only then in the memories of people. It remains nonetheless, and that kind of brutalizes the people, and there is a kind of new attitude. These artifacts are disposable. This has happened everywhere. Wherever they have tried to quicken development, it has led to two things. One, growth of authoritarianism, and there is no exception to this rule. Sure. In fact, an Australian scholar has given a name to it. He calls it developmental authoritarianism, because development requires a certain form of organization. You want to organize the society, make it more homogeneous, more predictable. Only thus you can quicken development, and therefore you smudge or erase the diversities.
But erasing these symbols of cultural diversity in some ways, does it also erase the memories? I know you've addressed this a bit, but I want to ask you pointedly. In Syria, we've seen the same.
No, it doesn't. In fact, it builds animosities in some sense. So, what were previously communities, intertwined communities, become contesting nations.
Now, when we look at some of these terrorist organizations out there, they seem to be picking up these artifacts and selling them, and they seem to be, funding their economies with that. Now, first of all, is it really viable for them long term to do it? And two, is there a way to protect these structures?
Of course, there is a way of protecting it. You can lift entire buildings and shift them now. I mean, the technology is available. The real problem is this, that you often want to show that your power by giving a free play to those demands, developmental demands, over the demands of culture and demands of identity.
Let's take a quick break now. Let's come back and talk more about what these symbols mean for societies and how symbols and structures and culture represents a society, at what point of time of history it exists. Welcome back. We've been in conversation with Dr. Ashish Nandi talking about, at different points of time in history, different cultural symbols have existed, religious symbols, symbols of what represents societies have existed. But when there has been a change, or a handover of from one regime to the other, or from one community to the other, they've been erased. For example, let's look at Babri Masjid, or let's go back even a bit more. When they talk about the temple existing and it being demolished to build a mosque. What does that mean for religions or cultures?
It's an attempt to distance a living community which is living in perfect peace with its neighbors as a stranger, the community itself as a symbol of humiliation of a larger community. in the case of Babri Mosque. This kind of destruction of symbols is also, looks like a symbol. The word symbol has a certain rarefied presence. We think it is not that important. It's not something very concrete, concerned with the day-to-day life of the people. But these symbols stand for the people. They are a part of your self-definition. And once they are destroyed in this fashion, something of yourself goes with it. Not only on the of the people, this is the case not only with the people who are sought to be humiliated by this destruction, but also by those who break it, because they are trying to break with a part of their own selves which was identified with the past, where another kind of culture dominated, where another kind of dialogue, tacit but nonetheless important dialogue, was going on between the communities and had gone on between communities over centuries.
Now let's talk about modern day statues of leaders, present day leaders being built. They seem to be wanting to leave a mark for future on who they were as leaders of their times. And one leader after the other, if they continue to build their own monuments, it's some form of narcissism. How does that reflect on a society?
Well, people somehow get to know this, that they know, somehow they sense it, that this is not truly for Ambedkar, or this is for the persons who have constructed the statue, that they know. So that is a different kettle of fish. In Tamil Nadu also this practice is there. Often I have heard of statues being inaugurated by the person whose statue they are, but they are. I think this is one of the pathological byproducts of spread of democracy. You cannot stop them spending public money. It comes cheap also for them. Public money for erecting such statues and getting away with it.
Moving forward, what will it take for us to maintain our societies to be able to kind of stop eradicating or rather demolishing these cultural symbols of societies, of cultures, of diversity?
Sometimes, when you talk of root causes, many people are hostile nowadays. They think these root causes are only a justification of terrorism, insurrections of various kinds, and so on, and extremism. But unless you go to the root causes, once you break a secessionist movement or a militant radical movement, it comes back again in a different incarnation. You have to look at the root cause of why people are so dismissive towards cultural artifacts, because they think it also is a toy of politics. Every society must learn what to put into politics and what not to put into politics.
Sure.
India, those limits have been crossed. We try to put everything into politics, and the result is what we are seeing all around us. This dismissive attitude towards cultural and cultural symbols is a dismissive attitude towards the identity of peoples, their self-definition, their worldview, and the meaning they ascribe to life. When you destroy something like a Babri Mosque, you destroy something of Hinduism too with it, because you cannot in the same breath say that I have destroyed the Babri Mosque because it was a symbol of something built by Babur. It's nothing except the name Babur. It was not built by Babur. Everybody knows that. Every educated person at least knows that. That you say that, but on the same breath you say that we are the best and most tolerant religion in the world. You cannot say both at the same breath. At least have some embarrassment when you say the second. That embarrassment, and when you lose that sense of embarrassment, you have changed Hinduism. You have made a terrible assault on the Hindu civilization. and turned it into a handmaiden of your politics.
Thank you, Dr. Nandi, for joining us for your insights on an issue which is so important for the world.
I enjoyed it.
Historical sites and symbols have helped understand our world and its journey. The destruction of these monuments creates gaps in history and an angst over the world we have today. The creation of these structures has a clear purpose, but the reasons for its destruction have changed over time, because nothing is absolute.